The earth was frozen beneath her split fingernails, unforgiving as a closed fist. Snow still clung in stubborn patches to the shadowless ground, melting only enough in the pale sun to turn the mud to an icy, slick paste that numbed her knees as she knelt. Elara pressed her face close to the soil, the scent of damp decay sharp and cold in her nostrils, searching for any hint of last year's forgotten bounty. A withered root, a potato missed by the harvester, anything. Her stomach ached with a hollow, biting pain that transcended simple hunger, a gnawing emptiness that had become a constant companion. Beside her, bundled in inadequate, fraying blankets, the baby, Lily, let out a weak, breathy whimper. It was less a cry of want and more a sound of simple, bone-deep cold. Elara's heart twisted, a familiar, brutal clench of despair. Every breath was a shard of ice in her lungs, every movement an effort against the relentless chill that seemed to leach the very life from her bones. She hadn't dared approach the cabin directly. It stood 100 yards off, a sturdy structure of dark logs and stone chimney, smoke curling thinly from its top, a sign of warmth and life she could only observe from a distance. This patch of ground, behind a low, rough-built fence meant to keep out stray animals, felt like a desperate, last-resort sanctuary. She worked frantically, scraping with a broken piece of wood where her fingers failed, eyes scanning the ground, ears strained for any sound from the cabin. Fear was a cold knot in her gut, mingling with the hunger. Fear of being discovered, of being chased off, of facing the harsh judgment and suspicion that had followed her since everything. She didn't have the strength to run far, not with Lily. Running felt like a luxury she could no longer afford. A sound, not from the baby but from behind her. A door closing, a quiet step on frosted ground. Elara froze, heart leaping into her throat like a trapped bird. She didn't dare look up, pretending not to have been heard, not seen. Maybe he would just ignore her, go about his business. Maybe. The steps came closer, slow, deliberate, neither hurried nor particularly stealthy. They stopped a few feet away. She could feel his presence, a still, heavy weight in the air. Still, she kept her eyes fixed on the muddy earth, feigning intense concentration on her futile digging. The silence stretched, taut and unbearable, punctuated only by the wind whistling through the bare branches of nearby trees and the soft, vulnerable sound of Lily's breathing. Finally, a voice, deep, quiet, devoid of obvious threat, yet carrying an unmistakable edge of weariness and solitude. Lost something? Elara flinched, a small, involuntary jerk of her shoulders. She swallowed hard, the sound loud in her own ears. Her voice, when it came, was barely a whisper, rough and dry. Just lookin' for something. She still didn't look up. Shame burned in her cheeks, hotter than the cold air. To be caught like this, scrabbling in the dirt like a scavenging animal. With Lily. The man didn't respond immediately. Elara could feel his gaze, steady and assessing. It didn't feel like the harsh, condemning stares she was used to, but it was unnerving in its quiet intensity. She risked a quick, upward glance from beneath her matted hair. He was tall, silhouetted against the pale sky, lean and weathered like the land around him. A dark beard covered the lower half of his face. His eyes were shadowed beneath the brim of a worn hat. He held a rifle loosely in one hand, but it didn't seem aimed at her. He just stood there, watching. It was unnerving. He looked capable, self-contained, like a man who asked for nothing and gave less. Her fear sharpened. This was the kind of man who survived out here alone, who didn't take kindly to strays. The cold returned with a vengeance, seeping deeper into her bones. He shifted slightly, and the faint creak of leather reached her. Ain't much left out there. His voice was still quiet, stating a simple fact of the harsh season. He made no move to approach closer, no demand for explanation. This quiet non-aggression was almost more terrifying than shouting would have been. It was unknowable. She glanced down at the small pile of frozen dirt and withered stalks she had managed to unearth. Nothing edible. Despair washed over her anew, cold and suffocating. Lily whimpered again, a tiny sound of complaint against the relentless chill. Elara instinctively pulled the blankets tighter around her baby, shielding her from the man's view as much as possible, though he had clearly seen them both. The silence stretched again, heavy with unspoken questions and desperate vulnerability. The man remained still for a long moment, his gaze moving from Elara to the small bundle beside her. Elara huddled closer to the frozen earth, trying to make herself small, invisible. She could feel the last vestiges of her strength draining away. The cold, the hunger, the fear, they were winning. She couldn't stay out here, but where else was there to go? He finally spoke again, his voice softer this time, barely audible above the wind. There's a shed, back of the barn. Windbreak, he didn't offer shelter inside the cabin. Not warmth, just a place slightly less exposed to the elements. A minimal offering, but an offering nonetheless. He turned slowly, the rifle still held loosely, and walked away, back towards the cabin without another word or glance back. Elara stayed frozen for a long moment, processing the quiet, unexpected direction. The shed. It wasn't much, but it was something. A tiny crack in the wall of her despair. She looked at Lily's pale face, drew a shaky breath, and slowly, painfully, began to gather her meager belongings. The frozen earth yielded no sustenance, but perhaps, just perhaps, a sliver of hope had been unearthed instead. The shed was cold and smelled of old hay and dust, but it was a blessed shield against the wind that had been cutting through Elara's thin layers. She spread their single blanket on the dirt floor and lay Lily down, huddling over her, trying to share what little body heat she possessed. Sleep offered no refuge, only a semi-conscious state of aching cold and anxiety. When she woke, the light outside was weak. A pale sun filtered through cracks in the rough sawn boards. Her body was stiff and sore, every joint protesting. Hunger was a dull, persistent ache. She checked on Lily, who stirred but didn't cry, her breathing shallow. Elara's heart tightened. They needed food, warmth, real shelter. She spent the day huddled in the shed, emerging only when the man was clearly visible working on the other side of his cabin or out by the barn, always keeping a wary distance. She watched him. He worked methodically, quietly, chopping wood, mending a fence, tending to a few scrawny chickens. He was alone, utterly alone it seemed. There were no other figures, no wagons coming or going. He moved with a quiet competence, a self-reliance that spoke of long solitude. She began to see him less as an immediate threat and more as a fixed point in the landscape, indifferent but not actively hostile. Late in the afternoon, when the light was fading and the cold deepening, she saw him walk towards the shed, not directly, but casually as if heading to the barn. He didn't look at her huddled figure in the doorway. He walked past, then stopped a few yards away near the corner of the shed. He bent down, placing something on the ground, a small, wrapped parcel, before straightening up and continuing his path to the barn without breaking stride. He didn't call out, didn't signal, just left it there, a silent offering. Elara waited until he was inside the barn before creeping out, her movements stiff and cautious. Her hands trembled as she reached the spot. It was a piece of cloth wrapped around something still warm. Unwrapping it, she found 2 thick slices of bread, still warm from an oven, and a small piece of cured meat. Tears welled in her eyes, blurring her vision. Simple food, but to her starving body, it was a treasure beyond price. And it wasn't given with pity or expectation, just left, a quiet acknowledgement of their presence, their need. She ate 1 slice of bread slowly, tearing off small pieces and chewing them thoroughly, savoring the simple, blessed taste. The other piece and the meat she saved, for Lily or for later if Lily couldn't eat it. Later that evening, when darkness had fully fallen and the air was bone-numbingly cold, she found another offering, a small pile of dry firewood left near the shed door, and beside it, a pail of fresh water. Again, no sound, no direct encounter. He simply provided, a silent, steady presence in her desperate world. This pattern continued over the next few days. Minimal food, water, what appeared as if by magic, always left when he was elsewhere, always found when she desperately needed it. He never spoke to her directly, never approached her closely. But she watched him, and through her observation, a tentative seed of trust began to sprout in the frozen ground of her fear. He was providing for them. He wasn't asking for anything in return. He wasn't judging. He simply was a quiet anchor in the storm of her life. She still didn't know his name, nor he hers, but a silent understanding was building between the woman in the shed and the man in the cabin, built on need and quiet, wordless provision. It was a fragile thing, easily shattered, but for now it was enough to keep the gnawing despair at bay, just enough to allow a tiny flicker of resilience to rekindle within her. Days bled into a week, then more. The weather remained harsh, refusing to soften its grip. The silent offerings of food and wood continued, a lifeline tossed into the turbulent waters of Alara's struggle. She began to move beyond the shed, tentatively helping herself to snow for melting water if the pail wasn't there, carefully foraging further afield during the day, though still finding little. She saw him watching her sometimes, from a distance, his expression unreadable. There was no intrusion in his gaze, only observation. It felt different from the stares she'd known before. She learned his routine, the rhythm of his solitary life. He woke before dawn, worked the land or his few animals, ate alone and retired early. There were no visitors. He seemed as isolated in his sturdy cabin as she was in her drafty shed. One afternoon, bolder than usual, driven by the need for variety in their meager diet, she ventured closer to the chicken coop. She saw him approach from the cabin. Instead of retreating, she stood her ground, her heart pounding but her resolve firm. He stopped several yards away, holding a small basket. He finally broke the long silence between them. Eggs, his voice was low, a simple statement. He held up the basket. Alara nodded, finding her voice though it was still raspy from disuse and the dry air. Thank you, the words felt inadequate for the quiet generosity he had shown. He didn't respond directly, just placed the basket on the ground between them and walked away, leaving her to collect the precious eggs. It was a small interaction, but it felt significant. A step from silent provision to quiet exchange. It built upon the foundation of wordless trust they had established. She learned his name by overhearing him call to a stubborn mule one morning, Caleb. Suited him. Strong, simple, enduring. As spring attempted its reluctant arrival, the weather remained unpredictable. One evening, the sky turned a bruised purple, and the wind picked up with a sudden ferocity. Rain began to lash down, cold and hard, quickly turning the ground into a quagmire. Inside the shed, the wind howled through the gaps in the boards, and the rain hammered on the roof. Lily began to cry, a weak, fretful sound that tore at Alara's heart. She was warm enough under the blankets, but the noise and the ferocity of the storm seemed to frighten her. Suddenly, a light appeared outside the shed door, a lantern. The door creaked open slowly, revealing Caleb's silhouetted figure against the stormy night. He held the lantern high, its light illuminating the dust motes dancing in the air and their small, huddled figures. For the first time, she saw his face clearly in the warm glow, rugged, lined. His eyes watchful but not unkind. "Storms tenin mean," he said, his voice slightly raised to be heard over the wind. "You'll take sick in here. Bring the child. Come to the cabin." Alara hesitated. Fear, deep-seated and ingrained, warred with the desperate need for warmth and shelter. The cabin represented a level of intimacy, of shared space, that felt terrifyingly exposed. But Lily's cries were growing more distressed, and the shed felt dangerously fragile against the storm's fury. She looked from Lily to Caleb, standing patiently in the doorway. He wasn't demanding, wasn't threatening. He was simply offering refuge from the storm. Swallowing her fear, she nodded slowly. "Thank you," she whispered, gathering Lily carefully in her arms. Caleb stepped back, holding the door open wider, waiting for her to precede him. As she stepped out into the rain-swept night, the wind snatching at her clothes, she felt a profound sense of stepping over a threshold, leaving behind the isolated desperation of the shed for the unknown warmth and vulnerability of the cabin. The storm raged around them, but for the first time in a long time, Alara felt a fragile sense of safety, not just for herself, but for her child. The cabin was small, rustic, but filled with a quiet warmth that felt like a miracle after weeks of bone-chilling cold. A fire crackled in the hearth, casting dancing shadows on the log walls. The air smelled of wood smoke and something else, something warm and earthy, dried herbs, maybe. Caleb gestured towards a corner near the fire where he had laid out a couple of thick blankets. Set her down there. Get warm. Alara did as he instructed, carefully laying Lily on the soft blankets. The baby quieted almost immediately in the sudden warmth, her little body relaxing. Alara sank down beside her, feeling the heat seep into her limbs, chasing away the deep-seated chill. She looked around the cabin, taking in the simple furnishings, the rough-hewn table, 2 chairs, a narrow cot in another corner, shelves lined with jars and practical items. It was the home of a man who lived simply, deliberately. Caleb moved quietly about, adding wood to the fire, hanging his wet coat. He didn't speak, didn't hover. He gave them space, a quiet respect that Alara hadn't expected. He poured hot water from a kettle into 2 mugs and added something to them. He handed one to Alara.
There.
With a bit of honey. The mug felt heavenly warm in her hands. The tea was sweet and soothing. It felt like the first truly warm thing she had consumed in months. As she sipped, she felt some of the tension ease from her shoulders. The storm still rattled the window pane, but inside, there was peace. "What's your name?" Caleb asked finally, settling into the chair opposite her, not looking directly at her, but towards the fire. "Alara," she replied softly. "And this is Lily." He nodded slowly, processing the names. "Caleb," he paused, then added, his voice low. "You been through some hard country, Alara." It wasn't a question, but a simple, knowing statement. She didn't respond immediately, the weight of her past settling momentarily upon her. The loss, the betrayal, the fear, the endless journey, the birth alone, the struggle to survive with a baby. It was a landscape more brutal than the frozen earth outside. But looking at Caleb, at his quiet strength, his steady gaze when he did look at her, she felt a flicker of something that wasn't fear. Maybe it was understanding. Over the next few days, as the storm blew itself out, they stayed in the cabin. The proximity, the shared space, slowly chipped away at the walls Alara had built around herself. They talked, not much, their conversations sparse and simple, but meaningful in their very existence. She learned he had been alone for many years, his wife and children lost to sickness years ago. He had built this cabin, this life out of grief and necessity. He didn't ask about her past, and she didn't offer it. But the unspoken knowledge of shared loss hung in the air between them, a silent bond. Lily, warmed and fed, began to thrive, her cries becoming sounds of contentment. Alara helped Caleb with chores around the cabin, finding a quiet satisfaction in simple tasks done together. The shared rhythm of their days felt natural, unexpectedly comforting. But the future loomed. She couldn't stay here indefinitely, a guest, a burden. Where would they go? The fear of the outside world, of returning to the relentless struggle, began to creep back in. One evening, after Lily was asleep and they sat by the fire, the silence stretched, comfortable rather than tense. Caleb turned to her, his expression serious. "Alara," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "This land, it's hard. Hard for one, near impossible for a woman alone with a child." He paused, looking into the fire. "Winter's breakin', but there'll be other storms. Other times of need." He finally met her gaze, his eyes steady and honest. "You can't keep livin' in that shed. Can't keep wanderin'." He took a deep breath. "I'm a plain man, Alara. Got little to offer but this place, and what strength I have." He hesitated, the words seeming to come with effort, yet a quiet determination lay beneath them. "But I can offer you shelter and safety. For you. For Lily." He paused again, his gaze searching hers. Then he asked the question, plain and direct, born not of romance but of necessity, respect, and a quiet, unfolding hope forged in shared hardship. Will you stay, Alara? And marry me? The question hung in the air, startling in its suddenness, breathtaking in its implications. Marriage. To this man, this quiet, solitary stranger who had shown her more kindness in weeks than she had seen in years. Her mind reeled. It wasn't a proposal of passionate love. It was an offer of partnership, of mutual survival, of building a life from the ruins. Fear flickered, the fear of being tied down, of vulnerability, of history repeating itself. But stronger than the fear was the weariness of being alone, the desperate need for a safe harbor for Lily, the unexpected peace she had found in this quiet cabin, in Caleb's silent presence. She looked at him, at the honesty in his eyes, the lines of hardship etched on his face, the gentle way he had treated her and Lily. He had seen her at her most vulnerable, scrabbling in the dirt, and had offered not judgment, but quiet aid. He offered stability, protection, a future that wasn't just a relentless fight for the next meal, the next day. It was a chance to stop running, to build. Taking a shaky breath, Alara looked down at the sleeping baby, then back at Caleb. The choice was clear, not between two men, but between two lives. A life of constant, terrifying struggle, or a life of quiet partnership and security, built on shared hardship and tentative trust. The resilience that had kept her alive surged within her, no longer just the will to survive, but the will to build something new. Caleb, she said, her voice stronger than she expected, though still soft. She met his gaze squarely. Yes, I will stay. I will marry you. A flicker of relief, perhaps, in his eyes, but mostly just that steady, quiet acceptance. He didn't reach for her, didn't make a grand gesture. He simply nodded, a man whose life was about quiet actions, not effusive words. All right then, Alara, he said. All right. The storm had passed, but a new chapter had begun, not with the fanfare of a wedding march, but with the quiet agreement of two souls finding refuge and purpose in each other's presence. It was a bond forged in the unforgiving landscape, shaped by necessity, strengthened by quiet kindness and mutual respect. Alara had come seeking a forgotten potato in the dirt, driven by despair. She had found, instead, a hand reaching out of the darkness, offering not just survival, but the possibility of a life built anew, grounded in resilience, shared strength, and the quiet dignity of starting over, together. The future remained uncertain, as all futures did in this harsh land. But for the first time in a long time, she faced it not with fear, but with a quiet, determined hope. The earth was thawing, and perhaps so was her heart.